Hello, and thanks for joining us for the latest installment of resources and information about education workforce housing. The title of today's presentation is Education Workforce Housing, Understanding New Research and Legislation. And there are a lot of interesting and new developments to share with you. Just a few short years ago, education workforce housing was an obscure term unknown to many either in the education field or in the legislature here in Sacramento. But because of the work that CSBA has done with our partners at UCLA and UC Berkeley, we've been able to elevate education workforce housing and take it from a curiosity to an actual viable means of increasing retention and recruitment of teachers and other education staff. And we're going to learn a lot more about the latest developments in that field based on the report that was just published this month, Housing California Educators, Insights from 9 California Developments. We have the authors of that report here today, and they're going to explore the details and what lessons we can learn from successful developments that have already been implemented so they can provide guidance for other LEAs that are looking to follow that path toward education workforce housing and increasing recruitment and retention of teachers. Then in the second segment of the webinar, we're going to explore current legislation, which is moving through the Assembly and the Senate as we speak to make it easier, more efficient, and more effective for school districts and county offices of education to both explore education workforce housing, determine whether it makes sense for them, and then to actually put that plan into action once they decide to move forward. So we've got a lot to get to, so why don't we move on to the next slide so we can begin our introductions and our overview, and also some housekeeping details related to how you can participate in the Q&A section of the webinar. I'm the moderator for today. My name is Troy Flint. I'm Chief of Communications for CSBA. I'm joined by my colleague, Andrew Keller. He's our Senior Director for Executive Operations and Strategic Initiatives. Also with us today, Patrick O'Donnell, CSBA's Chief of Governmental Relations, and Chris Reefe, CSBA's Legislative Director. I don't want to forget Greg Francis, who is our Senior Project Manager for Education Workforce Housing and our leader of this work internally at CSBA. And for the authors of the report, joining us, Sara Hinkley from the Center for Cities and Schools at UC Berkeley, where she is the California Program Manager. And also Manos I'm sorry, Manos, I'm mispronouncing your name, so I won't do that, mangle it any further. He is the co-director of City-LAB at the University of California at Los Angeles. Next slide, please. And for today's agenda, the first topic is going to be the CSBA's role in education workforce housing. I outlined that a bit at the beginning, but Andrew will go much deeper. Then Sara and Manos will review the findings from their recent report, Housing California Educators. Then we will have a Q&A strictly on those two topics, CSBA's relationship to education workforce housing and the discoveries from the new report, Housing California Educators. Then after we have that Q&A, we will move on to the second separate segment of this presentation. There's an overview of CSBA's legislative agenda, how we are supporting bills to make workforce housing easier and more effective, specifically going into AB 1021 and AB 1381. Chris Reefe will detail the information on those bills. Then we will have a second Q&A devoted to the legislative angle. If you want to participate in the Q&A, you can submit your questions at any time, but we will only answer those questions during the dedicated section at the end of each segment of the webinar. Please enter your questions using the Q&A icon in Zoom, not using the chat. That allows us to consolidate all the questions, go through and answer them. Sometimes staff will answer them directly in the Q&A section, and other times we will reserve them for a verbal response during the Q&A period. But with no further ado, let's get into the heart of the matter. So the objectives of this webinar, I will hand it over to Andrew Keller to tell you what you should get out of this webinar and what you can expect from CSBA and our partners.
Thanks, Troy, and good morning, everybody. So today we'll go through the findings of the recently published report that Troy highlighted earlier, and then we'll talk about the two pieces of sponsored legislation, AB 1021, and why it was co-sponsored by CSBA and city-LAB, and then we'll talk about 1381 and why CSBA co-sponsored it. That's a CSBA specific bill, so we're going to try and separate those two here. So we'll move on to the next slide. I think we have a little bit of housekeeping to attend to. So once we wrap up, we'll have Q&As, as Troy mentioned. So we'll try to get to your questions as we go. You can see the little image here that shows you where that Q&A function is on your bar. So in Zoom, go down to the bottom and click that to enter your questions. They'll be answered either in the panel where you put in the questions, or we'll do it live by one of our presenters. And then at the end, you will get a link to the recording. So you don't need to put that question in the chat. You will get a link to the recording of this. So we'll move on to the next slide, and let's start to take a look at why CSBA. So I'm Andrew Keller. I'm Senior Director, Executive Office Operations and Strategic Initiatives. I've been sort of pushing this work behind the scenes since about 2021 when I came on board at CSBA. This was one of the first projects I got on board right before we did the main, we helped publish the main report that was authored by city-LAB and Center for Cities and Schools. And really for us, it comes down to teacher retention and, teacher and staff retention and recruitment. Workforce housing is an interesting and elegant solution to that particular problem, particularly in high cost of living areas. California is expensive to live in. I think we all can relate to that, but certain areas are particularly high, especially for staff who may not make that money or have to commute really, really far, over an hour one way. And we want staff to stay in their communities, and we want school boards to think about using underutilized property for this purpose rather than selling off that purpose. So it's important for us to make sure that we're doing the right thing by our properties and by our communities and ultimately by our kids. So we're ultimately seeing some momentum, as Troy alluded to, in this area since that original report, but not a lot of success to date. So we wanted to know what's happening. So let's take a look at the next slide, and we're going to put some of these really our findings into numbers here that make it a little bit easier to digest. So what we're seeing is a bottleneck. We've been working with members for the last 4 years. Folks have been coming to our workshops, have been looking at our stuff on the website. We've had conversations with lots of you, and there's just a ton of interest. And these data, by the way, go all the way back almost like 20 years. So what you're seeing on the left is the number of school districts and county offices that have expressed interest, all the way up to those that have actually opened workforce housing. So you can see that sort of drop off. And these are cumulative totals, the number of LEAs that have successfully completed each of those steps. So you can see there's a big bottleneck early on and not a lot of success. So that's what it looks like in a nutshell. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll take a look at these numbers in a more visual way. So here you can see some of those successes on the left in a map form. There's very few, but the ones that are there are inspiring. Many of you have heard from Jefferson Union and Andy Lee and Superintendent Prest out there, former board member Kalima Salahuddin, right? There's tons of great data coming out of them. They started, once it opened, they had no teacher vacancies in their first year, and then only one in the second year that it was open, and their turnover rate dropped from 25% to 10%. And you can just imagine in your LEA the savings that you'd have if you were able to drop your retention by more than half. That's a big win. And then on the right, you can see sort of the interest around the state in workforce housing. Now, these are only projects that are publicly known. We won't dive into this too much, but it shows you that there's this groundswell, and this isn't even those districts that have privately expressed interest to us. So we want to know, why are we seeing this bottleneck? Let's go to the next slide and let's take a look at what we're hearing from our members. So the next slide shows you what the reality kind of looks like around the state as districts have approached this over the last few years. There's lots of quick starts, and many of them kind of start at this feasibility study stage. But if you can go to the next one, you can click one more, and you can see like this is where you can go back. There we go. You're not getting a lot of progress. They kind of start a little early historically and seem to end up and get stuck in this entitlement stage before shovels ever enter the ground. And it's things like the lack of experience, guidance, There's really no pricing controls for any of the studies that might need to be done. There's very limited capacity, or there may not be buy-in from, your full board, or maybe you've got some transition, or people in the neighborhood don't care for these things. So that's kind of what we're uncovering, and we're hearing from our members. And the research is kind of painting a similar picture. So we're hearing of research on one side, and we're hearing from members on the other. So we wanted to look a little bit more into what the successes look like to help us figure out how we might solve that problem. Done a good idea figuring out where the problems are, but let's look at these success stories. So here to tell you about the latest research that we're publishing are the authors of the new report, Sara Hinkley from the UC Berkeley Center for Cities and Schools, and Manos Proussaloglou from UCLA's City-Lab.
Thanks, Andrew, and beautiful pronunciation. Don't worry about it, Troy. It's a hard name. Yeah, I'm Manos Proussaloglou, co-director here at city-LAB-UCLA, and been working really closely with Sara Hinkley at Center for Cities and Schools and CSBA for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years really, on this education housing topic, and I'm producing some high quality research. Do you mind go to the next slide, Greg? So this is the report that we're here to talk to you about. Sara and I just put this out. I think it came out a week and a half ago, just about that. And this is really the second really significant report, third kind of academic document that we've put together as a team. The first came out in 2022, which was our foundational research report, really trying to quantify both the opportunity that was available to build education housing in California and also to start to lay out some of the steps and kind of the maybe quote unquote like traditional process, even though we've learned a little bit more about it since then. We came out with a how-to handbook to try to help districts actually build on their land. Now this is the report looking at 9 successful education housing developments that have been built. 2 of them are currently under construction, but essentially built all across the state. And as Andrew maybe mentioned, and I think Greg will mention it later, we've also been working with individual school districts to try to help them build their capacity and build more education housing. So it's been a really kind of holistic program, and one that's we think has been really successful. So in this study, we're super excited about it and think that it's going to be hopefully a really helpful document for school districts, both county offices of ed and school districts. We call them local education agencies, not to use too fine a, I don't know, term, I guess, but we think it's going to be really helpful for LEAs all across the state. So we studied 9 developments, most of them completed and open, a handful under development, under construction as we were doing the research. We surveyed tenants at 3 of the longest standing projects. Casa del Maestro, the first project really ever, or at least the first project in California, in Santa Clara County. Sage Park, which is a project in Los Angeles Unified, and 705 Saramonte, the project in Jefferson Union that we'll talk a little bit more about. Learned a lot from the tenants and sort of what they're liking about the projects and how they're responding. We interviewed 24 staff members from LEA teams, elected officials, consultants that worked on the projects. And then also we and maybe mostly ourselves and the team at City-Lab looked a lot into the actual design and development of these projects. So looked at site plans, photographs, collectively as a team, we toured various developments. So I think there's a lot of really robust information in this report. So Andrew mentioned this, but there's essentially been a big surge recently. Here you can see the projects that we analyzed in the report. The first one from the first stage was in 2002, second stage in 2009. That was the Casa del Maestro project. Then there were a handful that Los Angeles Unified developed and opened in the kind of mid-2010s. Sage Park is one of them. And then since 2022, we've seen this sort of big uptick in projects. Now, they started, a handful of years earlier. This process takes a long time. Sara will tell you a little bit more about that later. But we're starting to see a lot of projects come online. And what we noticed and what you'll see from this table is that the projects vary pretty dramatically. So many different types of unit yields, different sites, different kind of densities and scales of building, which is quite interesting. There isn't sort of a silver bullet solution to how you might build these projects. And this is actually what the projects in the report look like. So one thing that we found, you'll see that in a minute, but particularly high quality projects. Most of the projects are really well done, really well designed, and represent a variety of different types of housing development. So some of them, like Casa del Maestro, are kind of 2-story, 3-story townhomes with attached garages and sort of a more suburban style. Projects like Shirley Chisholm, for example, in the second row on the right there. A larger, higher density project in San Francisco, Eastmore Heights was a project that was actually developed using modular construction, so a kind of faster construction timeline, let's say, which is a pretty interesting model as well. Anyway, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about all of these, but really kind of interesting projects that run the gamut. And the one thing that's really important, I'll talk about that too, is that all of these are organized around, or the vast majority, around shared space. So they actually do have this kind of preference for the shared and communal spaces in the project that separate these developments out from other housing projects on the market. So this is pulled from the executive summary of the report, and we're going to lay out our presentation essentially talking about each of these findings. Education housing developments are livable and appealing for tenants. That's what I just started to introduce. I'll talk about that a little bit more. The development process, though, remains complex. Sara will start talking about this. She's talking about sort of the timelines the districts face, why education housing is a little bit more unique compared to other housing developments. We learned that early stakeholder engagement is really important. So getting staff surveys done, getting your teachers and staff on board, and having a strong development team are key, especially because these projects often go across school board changes and other things like that. LEAs are offering housing that is affordable to their staff. You'll hear also Sara will tell you some more about that, but units that are affordable and substantially below market rate. However, financing remains a challenge. That probably comes as a surprise to no one, but it's been difficult for districts to make the financing work. We'll talk a little bit about some successful strategies. And the last one is that LEAs are starting to pursue some new models. So coordinating with multiple districts, trying to buy existing buildings or sort of otherwise market rate buildings, turning them into education housing, using different financing sources. There's been a lot of new approaches now that the idea is no longer entirely new, and there's some kind of experience to draw on. So I'll talk about the first one. Like I said, when I sort of was showing those images, LEAs have built livable and appealing developments. And one way to start, and really one of the most important things, is picking a strong site. So this is an asset map. This shows kind of the community assets and things that are nearby to that project in Jefferson Union, 705 Saramonte. We visited this project. It's a beautiful building. It's not one that's especially walkable. Maybe that would be the one ding against this project's location. But as you can see, it's very proximate to a handful of different transit stops, proximate to commercial core, park nearby, obviously school facilities, the highway. And what we learned actually from our tenant survey is that, and this I guess was unsurprising, but it was good to see the data reinforce this, that these assets translate directly to tenant satisfaction. So 70% of residents said that living closer to work was something that really drew them to the project. There was a 40% reduction across the board in commute times, and the vast majority of residents were satisfied with these amenities. So actually picking the right site made it so that tenants who moved in really appreciated the housing and were excited about it. And then this is a oversimplification of kind of how architecture and design factors into these projects, but there's really two large considerations, let's say. The first is site design. So thinking about actually how the ground of the project is organized, how the buildings are laid out, where parking and social spaces. And we found, I mentioned this before, that these projects are almost always organized around significant shared space that takes up almost a third of the project's area. Many of the projects actually directly engage with the street. This is kind of a concept that architects talk about all the time, but put a nice facade up against the community, sometimes include actual community amenities like Shirley Chisholm, for example, where there's a public park, but really try to make it so that these buildings are offering a positive both face to the community and also a positive benefit to them as well. The last thing to talk about, I guess, here is parking. Parking is a serious consideration. Most of these projects, I think the number is 5 out of 9 use at-grade parking, so parking that's just on the ground floor. But often, if you can maybe see that from the diagrams here, essentially hidden behind the main street facade. So there's parking available, but the parking isn't the main sort of, let's say, impression that you get from the street. Some of the more dense new projects are actually built on top of parking garages. But in any case, a lot of what we're seeing is projects that have really nice, kind of generous sites that make the buildings that are actually sited on them really appropriate and attractive for our educational staff and the type of housing that they actually deserve. And the last piece I'll talk about here is just overall building design, so kind of stepping away from the site. You can see this is a smattering of images from the projects, and you can see a couple things here. First of all, there's various architectural styles represented in the education housing projects that have been built to date. Casa del Maestro is sort of the most, I mentioned this before, quasi-suburban, let's say 2 to 3 story townhome appearing. That's the photo in the middle. But then even the projects that are slightly higher density and bring kind of more units to the site, make more efficient use, let's say, of the land on which they're built, they also use a lot of really interesting strategies to break up the building. So the couple of images on the top right are from Sage Park, a project that I personally like quite a lot in Los Angeles, where the project is broken up actually into a variety of smaller buildings to help make the site feel more open, to help actually also bring a lot of light and air into individual units. There's these really nice open staircases in the project. That's the image on the bottom right that again bring light and air and sort of help circulation. And we heard from tenants that these are sort of the shared amenities and the way that the building actually makes them feel, and the units, the quality of the units is something they really appreciate. And then you can see even on the left, these are sort of maybe 2 of the higher density larger projects, Shirley Chisholm and 705 Serramonte. But there are strategies used to break up these buildings. So some movement in the facade, some different colors, some different strategies of organization, all of which really help these projects fit into what's generally residential context. This is something that we found from the research, and I think was a really interesting kind of architectural finding, let's say, that a lot of these buildings are built on residential blocks, on places where people are already living. And in order to make these projects appealing to the tenants and also appealing to neighbors, they need to be really high quality and actually made to sort of fit in. And a lot of these projects do that well. So now I'm going to pass the baton on to Sara, tell you a little bit more about the development process and how LEAs actually go about building these high quality projects and kind of delivering for their staff and their communities.
Great, thanks, Manos. And for everyone, we're sort of racing through a lot of content in the report, so we will have some time for questions at the end, but we wanted to just highlight some of what we found most interesting. So anyone who's paid any attention to the housing crisis in California has heard this many times. The development process is challenging, and we heard this from the LEAs when we interviewed staff and district leadership and other stakeholders who had participated. Keeping in mind that all of the developments that we're talking about went through the whole development process before they were able to take advantage of some of the streamlining legislation that's been passed in the last few years. So you'll hear more about that when we move to policy discussion later. But can you move to the next slide, Greg? Thanks. So in the report, we document a longer list of some of the advantages that LEAs enjoy when trying to build housing over other types of housing development. But today I want to focus a little bit on some of the specific challenges. One is that school districts are obviously not as familiar with the land use process that people typically undergo when they want to build things, because building schools is such a different process. You're dealing with a specific state agency. You don't typically need land use approvals except for the fringes of your school that might require city approvals. So this whole process is very unfamiliar to schools and creates some delays in the process that are good for that I think a lot of the LEAs we interviewed didn't anticipate at the beginning. The other challenge is that in most districts, certificated staff are going to be earning more moderate income household incomes. So this means that traditional affordable housing programs, although this is beginning to change, but traditional affordable housing programs are unlikely to be able to serve most of your certificated staff. I'll talk about this a little more when we talk about financing, but it presents a bit of a financing challenge. The third specific challenge is that the time frame it took for these developments from the beginning of board discussion to an occupied development ranged from about 5 to 11 years. In most districts, the entire board had turned over. Most superintendents, the average tenure in California is about 5 years. So this means that you really need some continuity in staff, you need some continuity in perhaps a committee. Many of these districts used housing committees or other standing committees to sort of keep the momentum of the process going, given that many of your initial champions might no longer be part of the district by the time you get to the end of the process. And lastly, most of these projects were not in areas that were already surrounded by multifamily housing. So that means that that land use process of getting approvals, getting permission, getting neighborhood buy-in may be more challenging because you might be in an area surrounded by single family homes with neighbors that aren't accustomed to having a multifamily development. That is one of the things that has changed a bit with legislation since most of these projects began. Can you go to the next slide? So this again is a partial list of what we found was helped LEAs be successful. One was, as Manos mentioned, to work very early on with your labor partners to gather information about what staff wanted, what they could afford, how they saw this housing development as benefiting all of the staff, not just those that were able to participate in the housing. Engaging with city and county officials. This varied a lot across these 9 developments. 3 of the developments were spearheaded or had very strong city or county partnerships, including city and county funds being contributed to the project. The other 6 had a range of experiences with city and in particular with city officials, particularly as they went through the land use process, went through the process of trying to meet the city's existing affordable housing requirements, but building those partnerships and using elected officials at the school district to help interface with elected officials at the city was one of the keys that helped the districts that didn't have those existing partnerships going in. And then, as Manos mentioned, having that cohesive development team which really manages most of that land use process. In all of the cases, except for one, a developer was engaged to do that comprehensive, start to finish, figuring out land use approvals, figuring out entitlements, managing all of the inspections that happen at the end of the process. The more cohesive that team worked, the more positively the LEA described that experience at the end. And if you can move to the next, I want to now talk a little bit specifically about financing. So financing, again, that sort of moderate income housing band can be challenging because those are folks that we know from some of what Andrew talked about at the beginning or much of our exhaustive research. These are people that cannot afford market rate housing, but also don't qualify for most of the affordable housing programs and other supports that are currently being offered by state or city programs. And even with owning their own land, every LEA is going to need to figure out some type of additional funding source aside from what is supported by the rental income from the project. So almost all of these developments use some type of financing. In this table, it says COP. These are certificates of participation. It's the way in which districts can finance part of the project based on the income, the rental income that comes into the district. In no case is that going to be sufficient to finance the entire project. One of the things that was exciting about the study was to see the mix of approaches that LEAs took, because I think this offers more examples for other LEAs to take on as they decide to explore these. But you can see, and we talk in more detail in the report about what that mix looks like. In some cases, districts pass their own general obligation bonds to help meet that gap, financing gap. In other cases, the city or county offered financing. In other cases, there were affordable housing funds available, and we hope to see more of those growing in California to help meet that funding gap. But again, there's more detail about this in the report. Can you move to the next one? One of the outcomes of the financing strategy is then how you're able to set rents, how affordable your rents will be. some of the financing tools that districts use will affect the way that rents are set. So for example, 3 of these projects used federal low-income housing tax credits, which requires that you set certain household income limits for those units, and then also determines how you set those rents. So you can see there's a mix of relationships between the rents that districts are offering on the units and the typical market rate rents. So in some cases, districts have been able to offer at 40 or 50% below market rate. In other cases, particularly developments that were built more recently, as costs have gone up, some of those units are going to be closer to 75% of market rents. So we see a range. Some of that is because of the type of funding that districts use. Some of that is because of the cost structure at the time the development was financed and built. Go to the next slide. And lastly, we just did some, through our interviews and through our tenant survey, we wanted to focus on the ways that these 9 developments really bolster the hypothesis that Andrew describes at the beginning, that these developments really are helping LEAs meet their goals of using these properties to increase retention, to be able to attract new staff to districts who might otherwise decline offers because of high housing costs. And we had 2 ways of measuring this. You can go to the next slide. One is simply that all of the developments are fully occupied. They all have wait lists. They have not struggled to fill units. The tenants that we surveyed all said, or vast majority said they plan to stay for as long as they can, either the maximum number of years they're allowed per the development, or for at least 5 years if they have an unlimited option. We've heard from tenants who said that the housing had made a difference when offered during their recruitment process. And we heard from interviews with district staff that they had secured new staff or had prevented staff from leaving when they were able to offer them housing. So these are anecdotal pieces of evidence, but they were it was very clear that this has made a big difference. If you remember one of the slides, or I think Manos showed this slide, it does vary some depending on what percentage of staff, the relationship between the number of staff in the district and the number of units offered. For the districts where there are 2 developments that have enough housing for more than 25% of their staff, and in that case, the impact has been more significant. You go to the last slide. And lastly, just in the words of the people that are actually occupying these developments, and we surveyed the 3 tenants in the 3 developments that have been occupied for at least 2 years. We have more of these quotes in the report. I think they're great evidence of the sort of life-changing difference that these have made for the staff that have been able to secure this housing, being able to feel safe, being able to have neighbors, being able to trust where they live, and being able to save money and not have to leave work and leave the area. So there's more of this in the report, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Manos and Sara. I appreciate that comprehensive review of the state of education workforce housing. I know there are a lot of interesting findings that our audience would appreciate. There aren't any questions in the chat currently, which is good for me because it allows me to satisfy my own interests and pose a few questions of my own. One person is asking whether these slides will be posted and made available. It is our custom to send out an email to everyone who registered for the webinar. And that email that goes out the following day will have both the recording of the webinar as well as the slides that the panelists use. So you'll have those available to refer to or to share with your fellow decision makers at your LEA. So one question that I would have for either Sara or Manos is, what was the most surprising finding that came out of your discussions with these various LEAs about how education workforce housing impacted their school district or COE?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's the one thing that we're careful to do a little bit in this report, which I think is reasonable, is not draw an immediate kind of cause and effect, just because there's a lot of other stuff at play. But I think the data that comes out of Jefferson Union is pretty eye-opening, and Andrew said it at the beginning too, that they've struggled for, decades with teacher turnover, with a lot of vacancies. The year that they built the project, there weren't any. The year after, there was one. And the fact that they, I think, have remained such vocal advocates. Last week, we were testifying in Sacramento, and Andy Lee from Jefferson Union was there and talking to try to get other districts to build similar types of housing. So I don't know. I mean, maybe not surprising, but I was really encouraged, I'd say, by the results out of Jefferson Union and by kind of how committed him and the team remain to this kind of housing.
Yeah, I would say that this didn't surprise me, but it was a useful counter to one of the things that we hear a lot, which is when a lot of districts embark on this, they worry that staff won't want to live surrounded by other staff, and that staff will be reluctant to live in housing that is owned by their employer. And we asked about this specifically in the tenant survey, and it was, to me, not surprising, but I think might be surprising to some, that really a lot of tenants emphasize the value of living around other staff. They emphasize, the comfort level with being able to sort of know who was living in their development, and that they just really felt that the concerns about living in housing that was managed by your employer didn't play into it. And one of the reasons that is because the school districts are not managing these developments. They're overseeing them in every case. And we talk about this in the report. They've hired an independent property manager. So districts are not involved in the day-to-day management. And it was gratifying to hear from tenants that, they're not seeing that type of concern or not experiencing that type of concern. And I think that's useful for the districts and board members who go into this wondering, what are we getting into here?
Yeah. One thing I'll just add briefly, Troy, related to what Sarah's saying, is we also heard and found in the analysis that we were doing, looking at these individual projects, that some of that's coming from the fact that these projects are being built with the goals and the needs of educational staff in mind. Meaning, like I said, there's a lot of shared social space in these projects to actually facilitate that interaction. There are class preparation areas, there are study rooms, there's in a couple of projects, there's these pretty interesting, this is a small example, but like laundry room that has a particular proximity to the playground, so teachers and their kids can sort of be connected and still work together. So there's a lot of ways in which the actual design and quality of these projects has reinforced the ability for teachers to and educational staff to, I think, really enjoy living in them and to no longer fear what they fear, sort of the being in a dorm or kind of being almost like in a substandard kind of housing. The fact that many of these are really high quality, I think, has helped with that too. So that's something we want to keep seeing.
Great. I appreciate that insight. We have a few more questions. People are jumping into the Q&A section now. One person wants to know, how do we get the report? This is a good time to reinforce that we have a whole webpage on the CSBA website devoted to education workforce housing. If you just Google or whatever search engine you use, type in a search for education workforce housing and CSBA, that should pop right up as one of the first, if not the top result. Also, there's a news release on the CSBA website, which provides an overview of the report and links to the executive summary and the report itself. So I'd encourage you to visit there. One other viewer says the happiness return is good. So this is someone who's enthusiastic about education workforce housing, but they're wondering what the ROI is for the LEA. I don't know how they're determining ROI, but if you could talk about how districts are sort of evaluating the success of their education workforce housing projects.
Yeah, I guess it's without knowing what the questioner means by it, there are two ways to answer that. I mean, one is the return on investment is those things we talked about, being able to retain staff. We talk in the report about, that there are monetary costs to turnover. There are educational costs to turnover and vacancies. And so being able to reduce that impact is valuable and is an important return on investment. If the question is more about the financial return, so none of these developments are sort of netting income from these developments. So there are, when we talk about innovative models, there are some future models districts that may seek to use land to develop housing that may produce an income stream. In all of these 9 cases, all of the income generated from the rents that staff are paying is going back into paying off the financing for the project. So none of these are long enough to have paid all that financing off, but after that sort of 30-year typical financing period, we might see some other creative options or funding that can go into the general fund. But the other important thing to note is that none of these developments are costing the district money out of their general fund or other resources. So it's sort of a net, there's no net fiscal impact on the district for any of these developments.
Thank you, Sara. The next question is, do either of you have any insight into projects with developer involvement in the project? I think all of these projects have some degree of developer involvement, so maybe you could just talk about the different models and how different LEAs have collaborated with developers.
Sure. Troy is right. I mean, all of these projects really except one had a strong development partner on board. I think one thing that is maybe a difference is really in when that development team is brought on. So in some instances, the same development team, meaning kind of developer, architect, sometimes even construction management company, are brought on pretty early, kind of around the feasibility stage, and then that same team continues throughout the project. Other districts have sort of split those two efforts, so done feasibility work with one organization, kind of had a separate procurement process for that, and then once they have an idea of what's possible on the site, then gone out for a second sort of RFP or RFQ for a development team. So that's maybe one way to make a distinction between how these various projects have gotten built. But yes, in almost every case, I mean, this is something Sara said it. I think maybe I obliquely said it too, but we all, I think, on this call really believe in education housing being a strong and effective model, but also recognize that it's sort of outside the wheelhouse of what schools normally do, right? So like schools have the asset of the land, they have the kind of need and the hopefully implicit benefit, which we're showing in this report, of what happens when you do build these projects. But what happens in between is complicated, and school districts essentially need some guidance and need some understanding of how to move forward with that. And partnering with a good development team that has experience building these projects or even high quality multifamily projects in general has helped a lot of these districts actually deliver and kind of maintain momentum across what's a kind of complicated process.
Thanks, Manos. The next question says, the big challenge board members have is to best understand all the financial options available and the pros and cons of each financing model. How do we get expert guidance on that?
Yeah, I mean, remains one of the biggest barriers, as Sara talked about. I think I would point people towards the resources on CSBA's website and on these various reports that we've written over the last couple of years, where we do talk a lot about kind of the pros and cons of each model and try to tease out how using one type of financing has X impact on rent and flexibility and kind of these types of considerations. So I don't know if that's a particularly strong answer, but that's probably the best answer I'd give. I don't know if you have any other guidance, Sara.
No, and I think it looks like CSBA can say more, is trying to answer the question in the Q&A, so
Yeah.
can give you more details about how to get that information.
Yes,
I would look at this report though. I mean, there's
Mhm.
going to be some information in there. You'll see us compare and contrast a lot of the different financing strategies that districts have used, and that'll hopefully be a good starting point, at least in evaluating, you know, which ones seem like they're worth pursuing in your district, and maybe which ones don't align with what you want to do.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, and I know Andrew is busy in the Q&A typing an answer. I'm sure he'll supplement what we just heard. But moving on to the next question. On the setting rent slide, only 2 developments, and really only one, Shirley Chisholm Village, appear to have found a way to take a truly material dent out of market rent. Targeting profoundly lower rent under $1,000 per month is a target our labor partners have expressed interest in as truly affordable. What are your thoughts on the plausibility of truly materially lower rent versus market? Is this an unreasonable expectation relative to financing options? So again, just that was a long question, but the person posing the question stated that their labor partners are targeting rent under $1,000 per month, which I assume most of the people watching this are from California, and you know that under $1,000 a month rent was extremely far below market. So is that viable? And if not, how do you balance sort of the disconnect between what the market can offer and what you can finance and what people's expectations may be?
Yeah, I think there's all of those are important questions, right? Setting the expectations at the beginning is really important. It's also hard to do that without knowing what your financing options are going to be. So there's a bit of a, you know, cart horse challenge that districts face. You know, identifying those goals with your labor partners and then getting an assessment of what's realistic. Just to zero in on a couple of these developments. So Shirley Chisholm, they used federal low-income housing tax credits for their project, but they also used other financing sources so that they have a range of types of units. So what you see in this table is that for the lowest category, I believe that there's a set of their units that are only available to those earning 30% of area median income. So that would be a lot of likely those staff that this questioner is asking about who would like to pay $1,000, about $1,000 in rent. So the way that this project is set up, the people who qualify for those units then pay 30% of that household income on rent. And then at the other end, so these high rents that you see in the second line for Shirley Chisholm are for households that are earning more like 120% of area median income and are effectively sort of subsidizing the rest of that project. So that's one approach, is to have a mixed income development, and we talk about that in the report as one of the innovations that we're beginning to observe, so that different people in your development are paying different rents. The Berkeley project, which is not finished and is not on this table, will have a similar approach. So I think in the reality of building housing in California is that without a significant public subsidy, getting rents across the board in a development that are affordable to low-income households at that $1,000 type of rent is going to be extremely challenging just with the cost of building housing. Again, that's a value choice that the district is going to make. Obviously, some types of development are more expensive than others. You can make choices in the way that your project is designed and built that affect the overall cost. But this is something to work on with whoever does that feasibility analysis that you do at the beginning. It's impossible to answer for each development because there are so many variables. As we point out, in 3 of these cases, they receive significant sources of public funding from city or county governments. If we do begin to see more other public investment, then you might be able to bring those rents further down. The projects that were built early on that offer significantly below market rents, you either were building in a very much lower cost environment or had a significant general obligation bond in the case of 705 Saramonte, that we're able to keep those rents low by financing almost half of the project.
Thank you. The next question is more of a statement, but maybe you can respond with your thoughts. The person says they heard recently that in a school district in San Mateo County, the housing was designed at such a quality that the cost of renting is pretty much similar to what the rent is for market rate housing. There has to be careful evaluation along the way to ensure the end costs. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that too. But I think one thing to mention is, so when we talk about like affordable housing, or we talk about low-income housing tax credit funded projects, like Sara was just mentioning, some of these developments are, those are projects that are able to charge low rents, but they're actually often built at particularly high quality projects. I mean, they're built with really high levels of required materials and finishes and amenities. So it's not, I guess the one thing I'd push back on is it's not completely a one-to-one relationship between how nice the building looks and feels and how much you can charge in rent. There are ways to raise some extra money to sort of have financing come in and help. And there's also ways to have really beautiful housing that we think is, you know, dignified in the way that it should be for educational staff that isn't immediately tied to particularly higher costs. So you're right, and that is an important balance, but I wouldn't say that you need to forego kind of a high quality project in order to make it affordable.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on districts selling land to build housing?
Well, we didn't, none of these are examples of that, and we haven't studied it. I think there are many possibilities of what that could mean, right?
Yeah.
Districts can sell land if they go through the surplusing process and there was actually one district, Jefferson Elementary, part of the funding they used to build their own housing project was generated by selling a different parcel of land and using the revenue from that. That's sort of a different animal, is what districts choose to do by selling their land. If the question is specifically about selling land to a developer and then the expectation being that developer then builds housing that's only open to the staff from that district, that's a model that we have not seen yet, and I think would require a more complex answer about how that might be feasible.
Yeah.
And
I saw Andrew pop on here, and I think we're on the same wavelength here. I know CSBA has a certain perspective. We're not really in favor of this idea, and Andrew can expand on that.
Yeah, we certainly want to make sure that it's always an option on the table. It's your land as an LEA, but the key is whether that's the first option. We certainly wouldn't advocate for districts getting rid of land. Just in principle, that's not the first place you should start, and we really want to try and avoid that to the extent possible. Because as many of you know, once it's gone, it's gone. It's very difficult to get that land back, and you'll experience pushback in your communities for it. And people view those parcels, whether it's a former school building or a parking lot or some other piece, it's an institution in their communities. So you'll get a lot of pushback on that. It's hard to get back. So we certainly don't advise starting there, but it's absolutely something to consider if it makes sense for your district in your local context.
It's like the old saying about land, God ain't making any more of it. I think that applies to schools. Once it's gone forever. So one of our members says they're not thrilled about having to go with the lowest quote. Is there any way around this for LEAs?
Well, several of the ones that we studied, and I can't remember offhand which ones. One way around it is to use an RFQ process to identify, to solicit proposals from specific developers or other types of development partners. I don't think we have time right now to go into all the different configurations of development partners that can occur. There's evolutions happening in the ability of LEAs to use the design build process. We had 3 of the developments, I think, used a design build process, which didn't require taking the lowest bid. So yes, there are ways around it, and it has been an important concern for some of these LEAs.
Thank you. We'll now move on to our final question before we advance to the part of the webinar that explores legislation related to education workforce housing. But before we do that, a member has a question about the Surplus Land Act. They want to know if LEAs are required to follow the Surplus Land Act if they follow the Education Code 711 process.
Okay, I'm not maybe Sarah knows
I think
it.
they're referencing the Surplus Land Act, which requires some government agencies to go through the housing and community development process to list their available land. That is not something LEAs are currently required to follow.
Yeah.
And in some other legislation, which we mentioned in the report, LEAs that seek to build housing in the ways that we're talking about today are not required to take those properties through the 711 process. So that's probably a question best answered with more understanding of what the questioner is asking, but that's the short answer.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I know I said that was the last question, but since it's Nancy Smith, I will add one more. I got to get to her. Are there any projects that work with the city or county to allow some units to be available for deputies, fire employees, other public agencies?
Yes.
So that's something that we're starting to see. I mean, the answer is yes. The project that's coming to mind for me, Sarah, is 231 Grant, right? This is a project built in Palo Alto on county-owned land. It's actually a kind of conglomerate, let's say, county-owned, county-led project where units are set aside for county employees, as well as a consortium of, I think it's 5 different LEAs that have a allotment of units within the project. So that's a sort of complex process or complex structure that they've set up. But indeed, that's something that's happening. And I think it's something that we're seeing LEAs being more interested in now, sort of collaborating with other public entities, trying to make these kinds of workforce projects all oriented towards public employees, teachers, firefighters, civic employees, people like that. And it's actually related to some of the legislation we'll talk about in a minute too, with the tenancy waterfall, as we call it in those bills. So maybe we'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute.
Yeah, and just to add, so there are more and more collaborations among multiple agencies so that units are specifically allocated to city employees, for example. But the other thing is that several of these developments have sort of a backup option. If they were not able to fill the units with their own staff, they can then, and this is tied to the waterfall that Manos just mentioned, they have the option of then offering those units to other neighboring school districts or city agencies. So it can serve 2 purposes. One, it can be part of a deliberate partnership, but it can also, if districts are concerned or if lenders are concerned about making sure that there are always enough tenants for a project, that one of the options is to have that as a sort of backup plan.
Great. Thank you. That was extremely informative. I know our audience appreciated it. I certainly did as well. We're going to advance to the next section of the webinar. But if people have further questions that they weren't able to submit in this portion of the webinar, please email us afterward and we'll be sure to get back to you with a response. We want to encourage as much interest and exploration of education workforce housing as possible. And I will now hand it over to my colleague, Patrick O'Donnell, Chief of Governmental Relations for CSBA, to talk about our legislative approach, and then he will hand it off to Chris Reefe to detail a couple of the bills related to education workforce housing that are moving through the state legislature. Patrick?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Troy. So really my role here today is to provide an overview of CSBA's educational workforce housing efforts. Our efforts in this arena are not new. They've been going on for a number of years. We have a number of bills we're very engaged with this year, and I'll turn over to Chris Reefe shortly to discuss the specifics on those bills. But just more specifically, why are we engaged in this issue? Because we're hearing it from our local school board members and our county board members across the state. This is something they need to provide a stable workforce for their own school districts across the state, educator workforce housing. They're seeing it in real time and giving us feedback about this issue at the local level. And interestingly, as many of you know, this is not just a very urban issue. And this is an issue that impacts smaller rural school districts across the state as well. So really, it's an issue that impacts all school districts and county boards of education across the state. And what we're hearing is that, yes, people would like some seed money to get their projects moving, but they'd also like really a one-stop shop, if you will, a place to go to seek expertise on how they best put together their own project at the local level. I know Chris is going to highlight a bill that would do just that and very shortly. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Reefe, our CSBA Director of Legislation. Chris, Lord.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so I think what's really helpful here is to start with a little bit of the legislative history. So many of you might recall that in 2022, we co-sponsored legislation with UCLA's city-LAB, and I'm going to ask Manos to jump on here with me. 2295 was really groundbreaking legislation to really address a lot of the barriers that existed for school districts and county offices to build their own workforce housing. Yes, there was already on the books the Teacher Housing Act that basically was permissive language in the statute that allows districts and counties to be able to do this. But really what 2295 is, it helped to step into those areas where districts may not necessarily, or county offices may not necessarily need to adhere to particular requirements because maybe there's superfluous. Can't do that one. But maybe, or in terms of timeliness. So the main features from CSBA's perspective that 2295 did was that it exempted local educational agencies from adhering to the Surplus Lands Act, to the Field Act, as well as particular zoning standards at the local level if they were developing their own property or property that they were working with to develop workforce housing. Now, in terms of the Surplus Lands Act, many of you might know, right, there's a requirement on local agencies, whenever they want to kind of dispose of or sell surplus property, they have to go through an existing process to, make it available at a lower cost to other local agencies, other local governments, or make it available to nonprofits before they put it up for sale at market rates, for example. This was ensured, exempting it from the Surplus Lands Act was helpful to ensure that there was nothing in a barrier of requiring the district or the county to have to undergo those processes, as well as the Field Act. So obviously the Field Act deals mostly with earthquake retrofit. These are not classrooms per se. They are school facilities in regards to providing a service for their school districts and their counties. But at the same time, these are residential developments, if you will, as opposed to in classroom developments, for example. In terms of subjective versus objective zoning standards, 2295 also exempted a district or a county from having to adhere to subjective zoning standards as long as they adhere to the local objective zoning standards. So that these can be cost prohibitive, right? If there are very nuanced requirements that, let's say, a local agency or planning entity would want to require of a district in terms of the design or scope, for that matter, of the project. And so these are extra kind of areas where we want to make sure that they were streamlined and exempt. We also stepped into the area of providing how do you address particular scenarios of vacancy and in terms of affordability as well. And so I'll hand it over to Manos to talk about the other key improvements that came with AB 2295.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think you've laid out a good summary of what we did. The other couple things to add is that, and this is related, it's definitely related to the next bill and the amendments that we're trying to make now to 2295. But in order to get these benefits, there were a handful of different stipulations, essentially, that you needed to hit. So it needed to be a particular height, a particular density, in a particular kind of geographic neighborhood. So what we're trying to do with the next bill is increase the sort of open the aspect ratio a little bit more and have more districts qualify under these benefits. The thing that Chris mentioned is that we instituted what I said before about the waterfall. So this was the ability to have first priority for education staff, second priority for education staff in the vicinity, third priority for public officials. So this was a way to, within this bill, kind of build in some of that security that would be able to give units or at least allocate units to other public employees. That was one benefit. The bill also requires a sort of mixing of incomes. So you can have just below 50%, so up to 49% actually market rate and still build within this bill. So that you might be able to get this kind of mix of incomes that Sara was just suggesting. Districts are trying to move towards now because it's a little bit more financially feasible. And sort of the last big takeaway, I guess, is that overall what this did was allow local education agencies to build housing on their land without actually needing to rezone the land. So this was something that we found was a big barrier and time sink in the first research paper. So actually now, first of all, you don't have to go through the Surplus Lands Act. As Chris mentioned, you don't have to go through sort of the 7-Eleven process. You're exempt from these other legislative barriers, and you're able to actually build housing if it meets those stipulations without having to rezone. So it was a really great foundation and one that we're now hoping to build on with 1021 and sort of expand. And that's really why we've moved towards this new piece of legislation.
So when we get into AB 1021, this is, again, as Manos was referring to, this is legislation that we're co-sponsoring with UCLA city-LAB, as well as Trio Plus, a local nonprofit advocacy organization in Oakland. So this is obviously some follow-up to AB 2295. One of the elements kind of within the construct of how we are talking about workforce housing is it was a novel issue, I would say, 3 years ago for the legislature. Workforce housing is a new approach to how you address, some would argue, the missing middle when we're talking about affordability for the middle class and predominantly public service workers. And so, as has been stated throughout this entire webinar, in terms of the benefits that workforce housing provides for local educational agencies, there were some challenges in terms of the bill going through the first time. And so there was a lot of focus on issues of infill development as opposed to rural areas. As many of you know, right, almost 60% of CSBA, or I would say school districts in California, county offices, are located in rural areas. And so unfortunately the bill had exempted, if you will, by requiring infill projects of this nature, basically exempted rural districts from benefiting from 2295. So we want to address that immediately. We want to make sure that all of our rural districts and our small school districts can access the benefits of 2295. That's one of the major reasons why CSBA is co-sponsoring this measure. It also addresses, to, Manos had touched on a little bit in terms of the income stratifications. There are an existing requirement underneath 2295 that 50% of a project has to be affordable for a moderate income staff or the public per se. But then also it would have 30% of that would have to be of low income. And so some of that was not reflective of regional economies of scale, cost of living, and just some of the rates at which and salaries at which teachers and classified staff, earn or are compensated. And so we want to modify that to make sure that whatever income stratifications are used, that they are reflective of the local economy, and that they're reflective of what the costs are, because we want to make sure that these don't inadvertently that the statute does not inadvertently prohibit a district from being able to, obviously provide this housing for their workforce, teachers and their classified staff. And then additionally, and I'll jump in here, ask Manos to jump in here a little bit in terms of the CEQA exemption. CEQA continues to be an area of concern in terms of potential project costs and project delays. I will say I know that there are some concerns when it comes to, well, we don't want districts bulldozing or taking over environmentally sensitive land without some sort of evaluation by CEQA. Of course, that is certainly, we want to be mindful of those aspects. Districts have to be adhere to CEQA. I'll say that this really deals with surplus property, so property that the district already has, and in many respects is an old school or a closed school, for example. And so in many respects, the applicability of CEQA is, not necessarily relevant. And so from that perspective, the exemption is helpful to make sure that there's clarification. I don't know if Manos, if you wanted to add anything in that regard.
No, I mean, I think you did a great job there as well, Chris. I guess the one thing I'd say is in the way that we've tried to draft this bill, which I think is hopefully going to be useful and add some beneficial flexibility, is that districts who have land that qualifies under XYZ stipulation for the CEQA exemption have the ability to go that route. But what we've ended up, or what we've tried to do is retain the ability for other districts to still use some of the other benefits that they get from both 2295 and now 1021 of streamlining, of lack of the need to rezone, all of these other things as well. So there's kind of a multiple paths, let's say, within this new legislation, which will hopefully bring in a lot more districts under the umbrella of these two streamlining bills and help a lot more people benefit from it.
And you remind me in terms of what you just said, Manos, higher education also already benefits from the CEQA exemption. So this very much follows the path that was created, right? The precedent that was created by that in relation to when it comes to, from their perspective, faculty housing and or student housing. So it very much follows a policy precedent that already exists for our higher ed partners. And so we're happy to answer any questions if folks have any on AB 1021. So I'll ask Troy to jump in and see if there's any questions on 1021.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A section on AB 1021. So is there anything you haven't covered that you would like to elaborate on, or?
One thing I'll share is, for districts who are interested in supporting the legislation, please do, you can contact CSBA at advocacy@csba.org. That's just the word advocacy@csba.org. We do have model resolution language available, sample resolution language available where districts can take a support position on AB 1021. That is critically important to be able to demonstrate the critical mass that is needed and how the legislature will look at this, especially as it comes to legislators who will see the long list of supporters of the bill, and they'll hopefully run into a district or a county office that's in their legislative district, and that will help ensure that their aye vote will be made and will be there to help support and move the legislation along.
And Chris, would you be interested in hearing from any members who might want to testify at some point or send in letters to a committee about the benefits of AB 1021?
Yes, if they're, we're happy to have any school board members who are interested in testifying. Like Manos had shared earlier, we were proud to have Andy Lee from Jefferson Union High School District. He's been on the board for over 2 terms and basically has helped spearhead the effort locally for the development of their workforce housing project, and really is a shining standard, if you will, and has been a great force in terms of really giving the practical and the personal stories here up in Sacramento in terms of the benefits that their workforce housing provides. So there's always that opportunity. We're always happy to help. And when we do that, we also, we help train the board member in terms of preparing them for their testimony. We help draft sample talking points. So we're, you're not left to your own devices. We'll definitely be there to help support you throughout the process.
Great. Thanks, Chris. There being no more questions, we can move on to the overview of AB 1381.
So this is a bill that the CSBA is sponsoring, and we're proud to have Assemblymember Suchi as our author. I will point out, I just do want to send some praise to Assemblymember Buffy Wicks and Assemblymember Mert Suchi, who are joint authors on AB 1021. As many of you might know, both of them are very ardent supporters and advocates for our public schools, and so very happy to have them as our authors for 1021. But in regards to 1381, this is really a product of what you saw earlier in this webinar, which was the slides provided by Andrew Keller, going over the initial barriers, right, that many districts face. And I saw one of the questions in the Q&A is like, how can we do this, right? How do we know how to approach it? How do we know how to, identify the folks who are going to be good partners for us locally? Well, this is a legislative effort that is coupled with a budget advocacy effort to help create a revolving and no interest if you will, revolving loan fund, I should say, a revolving loan fund that will provide zero interest loans to local educational agencies to help do that pre-development work, right? So if you remember that slide that Andrew had shared, it really showed that beginning the process, beginning the outreach, the working with your local stakeholders, doing the type of say surveys and or assessments as to what your needs are, and then also conducting the feasibility study, which are critical to laying the foundation to making sure that the project can be successful, are imperative to how this can become a reality for many districts. So recognizing that it's hard to get off on that front foot, we know that pre-development funding is critical. And so this bill would essentially establish a revolving loan fund in the Office of the State Treasurer, specifically in the California School Facilities Authority, where they would provide zero interest loans based upon an LEA size to help them fund that pre-development work, right? So that you can be able to get off on that good foot and be able to work and utilize the great resources that are available now through a lot of the work that Greg and Andrew are doing and others are doing with our partners in relation to getting the research in terms of the pre-development aspects of those projects. So we're hopeful that this bill will move forward. We know these are difficult budget times, but we also know that workforce housing is is fast becoming a critical tool to helping address our teacher recruitment and retention efforts. Happy to answer any questions on this one. I'll just reiterate in terms of the advocacy, if you are interested in supporting this measure, please do shoot us an email at advocacy@csba.org. That's advocacy@csba.org, and we're happy to share with you our sample resolution in support of these bills.
It appears there's no questions from the audience, so I'd just like to remind everyone how they can get critical information related to education workforce housing. Again, there's a dedicated page on the CSBA website. Just Google education workforce housing and CSBA. You will get a lot of information there. I would encourage you to check out our partners, the Center for Cities and Schools at UC Berkeley, as well as city-LAB-UCLA. Again, they're the authors of the report, which has so many good examples, anecdotes, and a lot of great data related to education workforce housing. We will continue to send out information through email as part of our regular communications at CSBA, and we will keep you apprised of developments in the state legislature as it relates to AB 1021 and AB 1381. And one question just popped up in under the bell, Al Grazioli, who has deep knowledge himself of education workforce housing. He's asking, does the LEA have the flexibility to spend the pre-development money with the advisor of their choice?
So, Al, good to see you, or maybe not see you, hear from you. The answer is yes. Obviously, as CSBA, one of our our major tenets is local control. So within the construct of 1381, certainly there will be an effort to provide assistance and guidance at the state level through an opportunity for folks to hear from those who are leading in this area. But then, of course, that money that would then be awarded to the district, that zero interest loan would be there to help fund those efforts. So obviously, I know there are a number of local nonprofit housing developers or other just housing developers in general who do help in regards to the feasibility studies, workforce surveys and needs-based surveys and so forth. So certainly we want to provide that local control, that level of flexibility that local districts will need and county offices will need in relation to administering those dollars.
All right, and before we go, Andrew, I'd like to give you one last chance if there's anything you'd like to say, or Greg as well, about our education workforce housing development efforts.
No, I'm going to turn it over to Greg because Greg got a few other things that are coming up here. But I just want to say thanks everybody, and Chris and Patrick and the GR team for doing a great job pushing these bills forward. We're really excited. 1381 is an interesting approach, and it's all about making sure that there's there's support for districts that are doing this, so you're not out there alone. That you've got someone that you can rely on. That there's some checks in the way that can make sure if you do get that money and you do move forward with those feasibility studies, you can work with the the developer that works for you, but you're going into that as an educated as an educated customer, that you know what you're looking at and that you can streamline the process from there. So yeah, and I'll turn it over to Greg.
Great. And one final note on that. The impetus for 1381 really has been our work with specific districts who have been in our training cohorts. And the feedback for us is that that is a really big barrier to moving on to development is how do they find the money for those feasibility studies when there's tough budget times? And, you know, is there a good, reliable source that will fund everything? And so that was really the impetus for us to co-sponsor this bill with Assembly Member Merit Suchi. So that came out of our learning cohorts. So I'm going to give a brief just reminder to everyone of what CSBA supports are, and then we will have another opportunity for Q&A about anything that we've covered, anything around education, workforce, housing related. Our goal is to serve as a one-stop shop and really help simplify for folks this whole process, as has been mentioned a couple of times. The benefits to workforce housing are huge. It's a really way to address staff retention and recruitment in a fiscally responsible way and make use of excess land that a lot of districts have. So it is great, but it is, you know, to get from recognizing that and to have your staff moving there and being happy and staying in your district for many, many years. There is a large and complex process. So our goal is to be that hub and catalyst that helps make it easy and helps you simplify that effort. We have all our members and we want to give them the resources and tools, training and best practices, connect them to the experts and consultants, and help give them the funding to make that happen. So this is our model and where we come in. And here's a little bit of breaking down how we do that. So for the knowledge, I'm going to share just a couple of screenshots of our resource library if you haven't seen that, but this is really the most built out collection of resources on education, workforce, housing in the country. We have a lot of fact sheets. We have the research on there, the research that city-LAB and Center for Cities and Schools have done. And one thing I'm really excited to announce is we are going to start offering an introductory boot camp this fall. This is going to be for people who are interested in workforce housing, but haven't gotten into the details yet on how to explore. So it'll answer those questions of what are my first steps? What do I need to know? How can I start getting some concrete efforts of if this is going to be good and how I can move towards a feasibility study. So that's something new, and that's something we'll be starting this fall, and that's really exciting. So just keep reading our CSB updates and going to our website. On the connections we have on our website, I'll show you a link to experts and consultants in this area. We also have cohort-based workshops that are in progress now, and those are on an application and limited selection basis. Similarly, I'm going to jump over here, technical assistance. We have a 201 workshop, which is for folks who are really in the feasibility and development stage. And then we have a series of tools that I'll show right now. So if you haven't been to our website, these are just a few screen grabs. So this is our main page, and you can see the subpages. We have maps, and there's two key ones. One is what you saw previously, but it is a map of all of the LEAs in California and where they are in terms of workforce housing, if they've done something on it and it's public. There's also a lookup tool where you can look up your own lands and see what's in the public files around what land you have available. We have all of our training materials and templates. So again, we've done our training series and we put videos of all of our topics here. We also have templates for every stage that you're going through, from the board resolution and staff survey, which are really initial. And then if you keep going down, you'll get a series of RFQs, RFPs, and even agreements for all of the stages of outside development. And then we have a list of experts and consultants who have become business affiliates with CSBA and have expertise in this area. And here again, you can use the QR code or just or click on this, or I could just simply, type into any browser CSBA workforce housing, and it'll be the first thing that comes up. So that's just a reminder of all the supports we have. And now we do have just a few minutes, but anyone who has questions about anything that we've covered, please type those in. It could be our supports, the 2 bills that we're sponsoring, the report, or anything around workforce housing. This is your chance.
We'll give that a minute to breathe, but I think we may have exhausted all the questions. We answered quite a few questions, both writing in responses in the Q&A section as well as verbally. So I will take this time to thank all our panelists from CSBA, from the Center for Cities and Schools at UC Berkeley, and from city-LAB-UCLA as well. You presented a wealth of information. Again, you can always contact us. If you don't remember the email address, csba@csba.org works. We will redirect that to the proper person and get back to you with the answer to your questions. So thank you everyone for your time. Until we meet again. Goodbye.